Good morning, everyone. This is Megan Jones from ICEA, here with you for the third and final of our deep dive into input distribution selection with at-risk, brought to you by Palisade and our presenter is Steve Van Drew. Today, Steve, as usual, will be taking questions throughout, so you can either use your chat box to send us your questions, and we'll call on you when we take a break for them, or you can even use the little put your hand up button if that's something you're into. It's a rainy day here on the East Coast, and we're moderately concerned about power fluctuations. So if we cut off unexpectedly, we'll reconvene either as quickly as possible or at another time. We'll email all of the attendees with what we decide to do. But having said that, why don't you take it away, Steve?
My pleasure. Be happy to. Good morning, everyone. Here's what we're going to be speaking about this morning, title-wise at least. And why doesn't this want to advance? There we go. It is the third in a series, a deep dive series is what we've called this, because there is both the mechanics of how to use at-risk as well as some of the conceptual sides of what we're going to be talking about. Specifically today, we're going to talk about turning expert opinion into an input distribution for an at-risk model, or cost-risk, cost-uncertainty model that you have the ability to defend because you put a little science behind the art. I need to make it really clear up front that this was chosen as part 3 of this series on purpose. And for those of you that weren't here and didn't attend the earlier ones, I just want you to know that they're available. Maybe Megan can tell us how to get to them, but I think they have an archive of previous technology showcase webinars. And if you want to go back to what I did on June 19th, you will see how at-risk can be used to fit distributions to univariate data. I chose that as the first one because everything these days is intended to be data-driven. You hear that expression a lot, and the cost estimating community is no different. The preference is for our models, our estimates to be built and backed up with data. Part 2 is where we start to acknowledge the data is not always available, and maybe more often than you're comfortable doing, you end up interviewing a subject matter expert, maybe some engineering judgment or whatever expert you have available to consult. Maybe the best you can get out of them is a min, a max, and most likely, or an optimistic, pessimistic, high-low, whatever you choose to call those extreme points. And so the part 2 of this series got into what do you do when you just have those 3 points? You go with the triangular, which I know as a cost estimator and former member of SCIA before it became ICEA, that the triangular is kind of the go-to distribution for people in our profession. I used that webinar to kind of push and suggest that with those same 3 points, you could use the PERT distribution as well, and showed some of the differences between them and maybe the thought process in choosing triangular versus PERT. Today's webinar is intended to take that a step further and say, please don't feel constrained when you don't have data to only stick with 3 points. You can, with a little more effort, as I'll demonstrate and talk you through today, with a little more effort and a little more careful conversation, interview of the expert, you can back up the choice of a distribution with some science, as I'm saying, and I'll show you how at-risk can be used to help you through that. But the specific objectives for today is for you guys as ICEA members to provide you with, first of all, an awareness of the difficulties associated with what's referred to as subjective probability assessment. That's what you'll find it called in the literature, subjective probability assessment. I think we prefer to call it engineering judgment. It rolls off the tongue a little easier. It goes over well, a little better with senior folks, decision makers. But I want you to be aware of the difficulties associated with that process, especially being aware of how the heuristics that experts tend to use, and this is based on quite a bit of cognitive psychology experiments and literature, how the heuristics that those experts you've gone to use can lead to biases. So I'm going to talk you through that. I want you to be aware of that. Then I want to present you with the technique for interviewing the experts. In other words, I want to improve on the min, max, most likely, let's call it triangular. And the specific technique I'm going to show you, although there are many of them, I chose because I've found over the years that we are so comfortable just asking those three basic questions. It's really difficult to get even the best intended analyst to ask many more questions. There's kind of this feeling that the engineers aren't very tolerant of us, or maybe they would push back if we ask too many questions. So the technique I'm going to suggest you try only asks 5 questions. So it's only 2 more than you would have asked before, but it does it in a way that attempts to minimizes the biases I'm going to talk about. And then, since this is being sponsored by Palisade, paid to ICEA to let me talk to you, I need to demonstrate what at-risk's capabilities are. It's very similar to what I've already showed in the earlier 2 webinars, with one primary difference I want to talk you through that if you've never been exposed to it, you might not have even been aware existed, even if you have at-risk. So that's the plan for today. And today, by the way, let me back up a second and give a little bit more of an introduction to this. Please bear with me. We almost hit Friday the 13th, and I looked back in my notes to see when I did a similar webinar for Palisade, and it was on a Friday the 13th, and I had all kinds of fun with that. So asking, how in the world did Friday the 13th and the number 13 itself get such a bad rap? And I Googled it, like you guys probably would do if you were curious yourself, and found out that Friday the 13th goes all the way back to 1307, the year 1307, when the French King Philip ordered all of the Knights Templar rounded up and killed. So Friday the 13th from, what is that, 7 centuries ago? For 7 centuries now, that one experience on a Friday the 13th has survived. And when we think of Friday the 13th, we are superstitious about it. Some people go so far as to alter their behavior because of it, maybe choose not to do significant things on Friday the 13th. I happen to marry a woman who was born on Friday the 13th, so maybe I don't feel the same way about it. It was a lucky day for me that she was born. But even though today is a Thursday the 13th, not the Friday, the number 13 itself has some bad connotations. And to go as far as to say, when was the last time you were in an elevator in a hotel or any large building for that matter, and went to reach for the 13th floor, push the button for 13, and wait a minute, it goes 11, 12, 14, 15, where did 13 go? I mean, just knowing that 13 has such a bad rap, many buildings don't even acknowledge that they have a 13th floor. So why am I bringing all this up? I'm trying to make the point of one of the biases that can creep into the conversations, the interviews you're going to have with subject matter experts. That particular one is based on something called illusory correlation. An illusion of a correlation has been established in our minds between bad things happening and the number 13, especially when it's a Friday the 13th. It's an illusion of a correlation. Yeah, in 1307, it was an actual case. So maybe we could even say it's another bias that crept in, a bias based on small sample sizes, relying on one sample and kind of changing our behavior as a result of that one sample. And to make the point, instead of just focusing on the 13, Megan and I were having a conversation before this started about the rains on the East Coast today, and we live about 2 hours apart, and both of us said, I could lose my power during this, so we decided to warn you. And she immediately, without even hesitating, shot back and said, well, yeah, I better do that, because if I warn them it could happen, that's the sure way of it not happening. Did you hear what I just said? She has in her mind this illusion of a correlation between warning someone about a risky, an unfavorable event occurring, and just the fact that she's warned us altering what otherwise would be a random event. So somewhere in her past, either to her or somebody she knows well, had that experience that said, oh, all I had to do was mention that this bad thing could happen, and son of a gun, it didn't happen. Maybe that's happened to her once. And now in her mind, there's this illusion of a correlation that says, and it's changed her behavior to the point that she believes, it sounds like she believed at least, you want to make sure something bad doesn't happen? Say it out loud, express it, tell people you're concerned, and boom, now you've reduced the chance of it happening. I could come up with many other examples, and one of the standard ones for somebody my age is probably, the idea that back when people didn't just have cell phones that they carried everywhere, it was you're waiting for a phone call, and you've got a home phone landline, and it's restricted to just the length of the cord. And so we're going back 20 years at least. But people would say, God, I know the minute I go in the shower, the phone's going to ring. It'll be whoever I'm waiting on a call for. Well, now we just take the cell phone in the bathroom with us. If it rings, you jump out of the shower, dripping wet, and you answer the phone. But at some point in the past, there was this widely held belief that all you had to do is to take a shower and the phone would ring. It might have happened once in that person's life. Taking a shower, waiting for a call, the phone rings. Whereas you'd been waiting hours and hours and hours, didn't ring, knew you needed to take a shower before going somewhere or just cleaning up for the day. So that one instance, sample size of one, and we all know better, and yet the irrational side of us jumps in and takes over. Those are examples of certain biases that creep in. They are very prevalent in what we're talking about today. So I really want to stop and talk to you about, in general, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on this, but just in general, I'm going to suggest that if this is something that interests you at all, beyond just how to do the mechanics of the fit that I'm going to show you in At Risk, if you kind of fancy yourself an amateur psychologist, then I really strongly recommend going back to 1974, grabbing what is the seminal article in this whole conversation. It's an article by two Israeli professors, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, called Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. This is the most cited reference in this area, subjective probability assessment. So if you want to go back to the source, it's a very well written, easy to read document. And what it presents is three different heuristics, rules of thumb basically, that they, Tversky and Kahneman, argue people use when they're coping with the complexities of estimating probabilities subjectively. And the point is, and the reason this is something that psychologists uncovered, was like in our business, when you're talking about something that's never happened before, so there's no data available, you go to the person that you believe is an expert and ask them questions about something that they're having to stretch their brain, so to speak. They're having to stretch their brain and think about what might happen. They're uncomfortable doing that. And when they're uncomfortable, they resort to heuristics that kind of have been bundled together into these three originally: availability, representativeness, and the last one, anchoring and adjustment. So those heuristics, though, can all lead to biases just systematically through the process of these heuristics, biases that can creep in. And I'm not going to individually detail each of the half dozen or so biases that the article talks about. I'll just highlight a couple to give you a flavor for it. In backup, I have a few slides that get into more detail. And like I said, if this is something that really interests you, you think you kind of like psychology. I did. I mean, I took a course in it in college, and boy, if it had been something I thought I could have made a living at, I might have gone that direction instead of the engineering and management science direction. But if that is something that really interests you, I strongly recommend finding this article. It's probably a dozen pages, very well written, easy to read. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. Availability is a bias. The availability bias has to do with the idea that you've got past outcomes. So this expert is, you present a situation and say, I need to know what are the chances of this happening, or how long will this take? What could this cost? How many hours? what's some way of measuring the effort of something that they're the expert at and anticipating. And so they think mentally, because they don't have the data to go to. That's why we're doing this subject. They mentally think about previous experiences. And so in doing that, they're thinking back to all the things that are kind of similar to what they're about to embark on. And if they happen to put too much emphasis on something that they can retrieve from their mental storing filing cabinets, if you will, then that subjects them to the kind of biases that we're worried about. So I live near I-95 as an example. I-95, if you're on the East Coast, runs from Maine down to the Keys, and it is a notoriously dangerous stretch of interstate, or at least that's what I've been led to believe. I do everything, although I live just minutes off of it, I go out of my way to stay off of I-95 because of how dangerous I feel it is. In my mind, that highway, that interstate, has more of a chance of an accident than anywhere else, in my mind. Now, how did that happen? I mean, if I gathered the numbers and compared driving a certain number of miles there compared to miles on other roads that I end up taking, the truth is, and I know this rationally, the truth is I-95 may be the safest thing for me to do. But in my mind, there's a correlation between driving on that interstate and accidents. And the rational side of me has me step back and say, wait a minute, why am I thinking of that? Well, the reason I think of it is in thinking of accidents that I'm aware of, that I heard of, it's always the ones on the interstate that get emphasized more in the media, by the media. I mean, a big tractor trailer smashing into something and, death and all kinds of ugly things happening, the media makes more of a big deal out of it. So it stands out more. It's more easily retrieved in my mind. It's been emphasized more, and so it took hold in my mind more. Another reason, and this is me, but I have a wife who was an intensive care nurse. I have a daughter who's an emergency room nurse. I have a firefighter son, and all of them have dealt with the accidents off of I-95. And they're not a whole lot of fun to have over to the house on Thanksgiving dinner or anything, because all they want to talk about is these major accidents. So I overhear those, and of course in my mind, there is reinforced is the idea that, oh God, that road is so dangerous, I'm going to do everything possible to avoid it. So that example, and it kind of falls under the heading of illusory correlation, is one of the kinds of things that can show up as when the availability heuristic is used. So I go to an expert, I go to an engineer and ask them about, and I'm going to use software lines of code later with numbers. So let's say it's a software engineer, and they think about the other software efforts involved, and maybe the one that was the most recent in their experience is the one that comes to mind easiest. And so they use that as kind of their basis that they're going to factor off of, even if it's not the most representative one, even if it's not the one that should have been used, it was the most available because it was the most recent. Or maybe they think back to the one that they had the biggest problems on, all the things that went wrong. And if that's what they factor off of, then we're going to get a little bit different interpretation of what lines of code can be and probabilities associated with different levels. So availability, you absolutely can expect that the expert you go to is going to kind of search through their experience and choose, without data backing it up, choose that experience that stands out most in their mind. You need, when you're asking them the questions, to get them to give you the details of that experience. And it is certainly within your right as the analyst to say, wait a minute, that's not similar to what we're doing. Remember, we're using C++ instead of Java, or some reason like that. So you kind of, if you're aware that this is a heuristic they're using and are aware of some of the biases that can creep in, you can help them avoid those. The next heuristic is known as representativeness. This is one that I mentioned a little bit ago about being insensitive to the sample size. Something happens one time, and in your mind from then on, unfortunately, there's a better chance of that occurring than it really deserves, because you've seen it one time. And this is the basis for stereotypes, quite frankly. I mean, if you see a young teenager racing through a neighborhood in their car, they just turned 16 and they drive too fast through the neighborhood, from then on, every time you see a car speed through your neighborhood, you may say, oh, there goes one of those darn teenagers again. And the truth is, it could be anyway. A mom on her, taking a kid to soccer practice, a husband on his way to, late for work, or to go pick up the groceries. Or it could be, which was my experience, Sunday morning, family heading off to church. They're late for church, and so they're speeding through the neighborhood. But if you take an example, something one time, and then use that and branch off of that and base your predictions on the sample size of one, that is a bias that can creep in. Here's a little story to go along with that one. I don't remember quite how long ago it was now, maybe 6 months ago or so, but I read a really sad story about a family taking their dog to the vet, and the vet got the instructions mixed up and euthanized their perfectly healthy dog. Very sad story, and I'm kind of sad to bring it up. Sorry to even present it to you, but it gives me an example to tell you just how something like that, hearing about it, I wasn't even personally affected by it, except that I felt sorry for that family. But that sample of one, a dog mistakenly being euthanized, has changed my behavior. I took my dog to be groomed yesterday, and I trust me, I spent much more time than really was warranted asking questions, watching, observing as the groomer took my dog away, because not that the groomers euthanize them at all, but just concerned that something could happen bad because I'd heard this one story. So I'm an annoyance to them. I'm wasting more of my time, all because of a sample size of one. I heard of one dog mistakenly being euthanized. There's a couple other really interesting biases in here. One of them is called the misconception of chance, or it kind of jokingly is called the law of small numbers. It also is referred to as gambler's fallacy, thinking that randomness can self-correct. If you're an Ozark fan, and I know a lot of people are watching it on Netflix these days, I almost, honest to God, fell on the floor off the couch laughing out loud when Marty Byrde, main character in Ozark, who's operating this gambling casino so he can launder money, started describing to people the law of large numbers. I thought that was hilarious, and he did it because the people he was expressing it to, he was trying to correct them from having the gambler's fallacy idea, the idea that since that slot machine just paid off, it's going to be a long time before it pays off again. No, you can't think that way with one at a time. You have to trust that when something is occurring in large groups, large samples, then there is, you can trust the statistical nature of what's going on, but you can't drill down and just think about any one time and 2 in a row, 3 in a row. You've got to really trust the law of large numbers and let that operate. I'm not sure if I explained that quite as well as it deserves. That's called misconception of chance, or jokingly, law of small numbers and the gambler's fallacy. So representativeness is when you relate to events. This is what's about to happen. I've done something like that in the past. Let me use that as my example. Even when the two are not necessarily belonging to be related, which gets us to anchoring and adjustment as the third of the heuristics that these gentlemen wrote the article about. This is the one I'm going to concentrate on the most, especially since the group I'm talking to today, cost estimators, I'm going to confess, because I was one of you, do this by design. And what I mean by this is cost estimators, we're anxious to get to a point estimate. So we put together our WBS, or cost work breakdown structure. We go through the cost elements, and anywhere where there's not data, we go to, hopefully we've got subject matter experts available to go to. And the first time you have a conversation with these different people. All you care about is one number. Give me your best guess, whatever you choose to call it. We turn around, plug that into our model, the single number, generate a point estimate, and it's not until we have a chance to go back later, maybe the decision is made, okay, let's go ahead with this. You go back and you flesh it out more and you start putting probabilities around the areas of risk and uncertainty. And that's how we're taught to do it. And in doing that, I can imagine going back to maybe the same expert that gave you a number of hours needed or the rates that were going to be used, things like that, and saying, you remember a couple months ago we had a conversation about this and you told me you needed 10,000 hours for this. I now need to put a distribution around there. I need to model that with uncertainty. So can you give me a min, a max to go with that, what I'm going to call a most likely value that you've already provided? What we've done, if that's your approach to this, what we've done is designed anchoring and adjustment as a heuristic that leads to biases that include insufficient adjustment. And what the authors that are listed on this slide talk about is in way too many situations, once an individual is allowed to get anchored on a single value, like we've done with them, that the adjustment around that is insufficient. You end up with distributions that are too tight. We don't do a very good job modeling the extreme cases, especially when we allow this anchoring and adjustment heuristic to kick in. Because this is a cost estimating group, because I was a cost estimator, this is the one I paid the most attention to trying to overcome. And I know what the Air Force cost uncertainty handbook says to do. It says to ask for the most likely and to ask for the two extremes in a way that captures 70% of what can happen. So they've taken their own approach. The Air Force's approach to it takes a different approach on this and says, instead of calling them min and max, let's ask for two values that capture 70%. And from there, there's some things that can be done. Maybe the triangular again, and I talked about that some in the last webinar. So if you've heard of that approach before, keep that in the back of your mind and watch what I'm going to do in a moment that tries to compensate for this anchoring and adjustment idea. Once again, the danger is once a single value is known, even if it was only ever intended as the, say, mode, the most likely, when you then go back, especially if you remind them that, hey, you've already given me this number, I need to get some bounds around that, they will insufficiently adjust around that anchored point. Before I move on, let me ask Megan or maybe Chelsea if we have any questions yet.
No questions yet. I think you're good to go.
Okay, thank you. So while the last thing off of this slide, you know, if you're looking for another reason to want to go study this, the individual here, Daniel Kahneman, maybe that name rings a bell to those of you that have studied economics. He is one of the fathers of behavioral economics, got a Nobel Prize about 10 years ago in economics as a psychologist. So that's how profound this article and this gentleman in particular became over the last 40 years or so. Was he fathered a brand new side of economic science that relies on the behavioral side that has its basis in these heuristics and the biases that creep in. So this is not just a psychology paper is the point I'm trying to make. This is very relevant to what we're doing. This is a topic that very few people get exposed to when they go to school. Problem stats classes don't tend to teach this because your problem stats professors want you to know how to handle data. There's no data involved here. This is you going to an expert in the absence of data and trying to come up with a distribution that you can defend. The point is the experts you go to are going to rely on these heuristics. These heuristics have biases that are present. We need to come up with a way to overcome those biases. That's where I'm headed. Don't know why my computer, there we go. So there are a number of different ways of doing this, and my backup slide gives you maybe half a dozen or so. The one over the years that I've found has the best chance of being used instead of ignored, or instead of just falling back on the traditional min, max, and most likely. It's got a fancy name. Don't let the name scare you off, but it's called, in the literature at least, it's called a fractal specification technique. I am going to present you with a specific version of that called the 5-point fractal specification. Before going through each of the bullets, I want to make it real clear that this may sound fancy, but it ultimately is only trying to establish 5 pairs of values along a cumulative distribution function. That's its objective. In fact, if you look at most of the techniques in my backup slides that we could have talked about, they all have that same objective. Don't just find something that's a min, a max, and a most likely, because the truth about min and max especially is I don't know whether when I asked the question, and more importantly, when you answered it as the expert, what probability, what cumulative probability you had associated with min max. I might have intended you to give me the absolute min and the absolute max, and you gave me one that was at the 5th and 95th or 10th and 90th. If we never have that conversation, if I never ask you more directly, what are the chances of being below the min, above the max, or call them low and high, or call them optimistic, pessimistic, without nailing it down any better, then you're back resorting to either a triangular or PERT distribution and kind of treating those as absolute min and max, when that may not have been what the questioner and the answer to the conversation had intended. So the first point of this is we're going to be more specific in the way we ask the questions. We're going to not just ask for something as a low, a high, a min, a max, an optimistic, pessimistic. If we're going to call it a min, we're going to say min as in 1 chance in 100 that you're there or less. Max as in 1 chance in 100 that you're there or more. Okay. When you do that, you have a cumulative distribution and a value together. If you get enough of those, you can plot a CDF through those points, and what at-risk will do is through a series of hypotheses, will find us a best fitting distribution through these points. At-risk only needs 3 points to do that. 3 pairs of cumulative probability values. This approach is going to let us do it with 5. So here's in essence the way this one says to do it. First bullet, you're going to come up with the 0.01 and the 0.99 fractal. Fancy way of saying a cumulative probability of 1, cumulative probability of 99, 0.99 and 0.01. So give me a value that there's 1 chance in 100 of being there or less. Give me a value at the other extreme of 99 chances out of 100 being there or less, which is the same thing as saying 1 chance in 100 of being beyond that. Now, the question at this point would be, do you have to use 0, 1, and 99? And in the lower section, what I'm telling you is, no, you don't have to do that. In fact, if you start out asking 0, 1, and 99, and they say, well, I'm not comfortable going to those extremes, well, then if you want to call it 0.5 and 95 or 0.10 and 0.90, that's fine, as long as I have the value and the cumulative probability pair. So I've recommended down here, you could just as well have used 0.5, 95. Now, why is that the first bullet in this approach? And it really is intended to be asked first. And the answer is it goes back to that anchoring and adjustment heuristic. I'm not getting them, I'm not allowing them to anchor on something towards the central tendency. I'm forcing them to think of the extremes first. Now, there's other things involved here. And I'm sure you've thought about these, and if you're not asking about it, you're probably thinking about it. Isn't part of this getting the right expert? And the answer is absolutely. What if I have multiple experts? Well, there's approaches for combining the different experts' opinions into a single, either one that they've agreed upon or one that you, without their consultation, you kind of combine into a single one. Maybe you're treating them equally, or you're weighting one expert more than another, but there are ways of doing this with multiple people also. But the point of approaching this specification technique in this order says, let's go to the extremes first. assuming I've got the right person involved. And it also says you've got to document this conversation. So when they put a value out there at 1 chance in 100, you're within your rights to say, can you tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking? You know, so they'll relate the experience that got them thinking that, and you're writing notes to yourself for documentation purposes later. So it's not like you just going in and saying, give me the 01, give me the 99. There's more of a conversation happening here. Once you've got those two, and you've pushed them out to those extremes as best you can, the next point is to ask them for the median. The median is the 0.5 or the 50th percent. I would be careful here. I'm not sure I would say median to the people you're talking to. Not everybody appreciates the subtle difference between mean, median, mode. In fact, a lot of people always gravitate towards the normal distribution in their mind. And if they're doing that, then mean, median, mode are all the same thing. Symmetric unimodal distribution like the normal, what's the difference? Mean, median, mode, they're all the same. So because of that possible confusion, I think it's better just to ask them for a point that there's the same chance of being above as below. And if you ask for it that way, then you're, without saying it, you're asking for the median. You're asking for the 0.5 fractal, okay? Just a caution here. And then once we've done that, so at this point after the 2 bullets, we have an 01 and 99. We've now got the 0.5. Well, now you're going to go in and you're going to break those 2 halves that the median split the distribution into and find what are called the interquartile values. And you certainly wouldn't use that word, but you may just say, give me a value that there's 1 chance in 4 of being there or less, 1 chance in 4, or 3 out of 4 being there or less, 1 in 4 being there or more. However you phrase it, the more layman's terms you can throw in, the less you're going to scare off people who are kind of phobics about probability. But I'll say it again. You don't have to be a slave to these specific amounts. Here's a suggested one down below, and just as easy to work with as 2.5 and 7.5 is 1/3, 2/3. Okay, so whatever you're comfortable with, or more importantly, whatever they're comfortable with, when I'm done with this approach, extremes first, followed by the median, followed by 2 somewhere between the median and each of the extremes. I'll have 5 pairs. Okay. Here is, and I'll send this out as a spreadsheet with you. I'm going to demonstrate it in the spreadsheet shortly, but I'll make this available to all of you. Here is in tabular form what I'm doing. I'm asking the questions here in this table on the left, fractal specification assessment table, fancy term, but I'm going in the order 0.01, 0.99, then I'm going to the 0.5, then I'm going to the 2 interquartiles. So in that order, get the extremes, get the median, get the 2 interquartiles, populate this table's representative values, and if you've got it, like I'm going to show you in the spreadsheet set up to do it, what you're generating are 5 pairs of points on a cumulative distribution function. The X along the horizontal axis, the cumulative probabilities along the vertical axis. Okay. And so depending on the spacing of these 5 values will change the shape of that CDF, that S curve, if you want to think of it that way. And what we're hoping to be able to do is to choose a distribution that best fits the mapping of those 5 pairs of data points. That's going to get us away from, ideally, getting away from always using a triangular or even a PERT distribution. And what at-risk will do for us with these 5 pairs of points is it's a specific data type in the feature I'm going to show you called cumulative XP points. And then it does a fit based on root mean squared error, which is to all the costers in the group immediately conjures up ideas of regression, I'm sure, but it's the same fundamental idea. We're going to overlay the different S curves, or at risk, we'll overlay the different proposed hypothesized S curves. It'll calculate the error, vertical error between the point out of the table and the hypothesized S curve. It'll square those errors up, add them together, divide by 5 in this case because there's 5 of them, and then take the square root. Root mean squared error. Okay, so that's what it's doing. I'm going to show you a live example of this, but maybe now's the time to ask again for questions. Looks like we're still good.
Still clear. Yep.
Okay, so going into Excel. And I don't know whether this group, anybody in the group is an at-risk user, so I'm going to kind of take for granted that maybe you're not. And there's the Milky Way, yay. So this is the spreadsheet I'll send out to you, and you can see the at-risk ribbon at the top. This is the newest version of at-risk, came out in about February, March, called at-risk 8.0. I have the industrial version of this, and the reason I'm making that point is if you don't have the industrial version, then you won't have the time series feature here, which is really cool, and you won't have the optimization. So if this looks foreign to you, even as an at-risk user, that's what's going on. It's the newest version of at-risk 8.0, and it is the industrial version. So I have optimized and time series present. Here's the same table we were looking at a moment ago, only I've operationalized this in Excel to do this for me. And I need to explain what I've done real quickly. There's the same 5 questions I would ask. I'm going to populate the table in yellow, and then I've got the table being flipped essentially so that the X's are on the left and the cumulative probabilities, which are the P's, are on the right. It needs to be set up that way so that at-risk can use it. In fact, it would bark at us. It would tell us there's an error if you tried feeding it the table like this. Well, it makes complete sense to have the table built this way. My questions are on the left, the answers are on the right, but at-risk needs the X's followed by the P's in that order. So that flip is taking place. The other thing that's going to be happening is when I build this in Excel, before even doing a fit, you'll see that it's going to plot automatically for me the S-curve. And when I do the fit, I'm going to have it placed in that cell on purpose for some other things I'll show you shortly. So here we go. Here's a basic example. I'm going to do, and if you're working for Price or somebody like that, then you'll say, whoa, you're kidding. You really would do that? Probably not to the extent I'm going to demonstrate. But let's say we've got a software effort for a weapon system we're talking about. Software being a big part of most weapon systems. So we've got source lines of code, or ESLOC even, equivalent source lines of code, and I'm going to do this in thousands of ESLOC. So I would go to a software engineer and make sure that they've got the same basic description of what the software effort is as me, so we're on the same sheet of music. And with all of that background out of the way, then I'd start asking them the questions in the same order I talked through. I'd say, can you give me a number of equivalent source lines of codes in thousands so that there's only one chance in 100 that we need that many lines of code or less? Okay, I've just asked for the 0.01 fractile, and their answer is going to come back, no surprise, a nice round number. They're going to they'll say something like maybe 400,000 lines of code. Then I would go to the other extreme. And I would say, can you give me, in your mind, the number of lines of equivalent source lines of code in thousands we might need, so there's only one chance in 1,000 that we would need even more. So I'm asking for it as one chance in 100 of exceeding that, which is the same thing as saying 99 out of 100 of being there or less. And let's say that they tell me 1.4 million, so I'm going to pop 1,400 in there. Now, this S-curve is being drawn squirrely because it still has 3 points to establish, but you see that they're tied to that table. Next one, I'm going to go to the median value, but it turns out the software engineer I'm working with has already admitted he hates probability. So instead of saying, can you give me a median number, I'm going to say, in your mind, what's the number of equivalent source lines of code that we might have the same chance of being above as below? Now, here is another caution to you if you're going to do this. If they were to go in, see that the difference is 1,000 and divide that in half, 500 plus that, or subtract it from that, will put me at 900. I would start to suspect that all they're doing is feeding me the numbers, because very little of what we do in our business is symmetric. So I'm pleasantly surprised to see when I ask that question that the expert is telling me 700 instead of 900. So now I know they're at least putting some thought into it and are not just splitting the difference. Then I'm going to go to the 0.25. Can you give me a number of equivalent source lines of code that has about a 25% chance of needing that many or less? And they say 500. All right, good. We're not splitting the difference again. And that brings us to the last one. And when I ask this question, I could either ask it as 75% being there or less, 25% being there or more, and they're going to give me another nice round number, no surprise, but they still are not perfectly splitting the difference. Bang, we have 5 cumulative probabilities and their associated numbers of equivalent source lines of code in thousands. There is our subjectively assessed CDF. So without something like at risk, you may have to resort to just treating this as a discrete distribution. One chance out of 100 of being there or less, call it 400, and you could use these as representative values and set up your simulation to just sample those 5 values depending on what the random number generated is. Or if you've got the ability to do it, you go in and you find a distribution that as best you can follows the same 5 points as an S-curve, and that's what at-risk will do for us. Here's how it works. From this table, because it's flipped so that the X's are on the left, the P's are on the right, I'm going to come up to the Fit button in my at-risk ribbon. It says it fits distributions to data, and the top choice here is the one we want, because we're only doing one of these, not a batch of them. And it already knew, because I had it highlighted, that I'm using the values in F3 to G7. It's guessing I want to call it representative value. Now, why don't I just go ahead and change that while I'm here, ESLOC, and parenthesis K. So we've got tens of thousands of equivalent source lines of code. And this is an interesting one. If you've never seen this before, at-risk will fit distributions to date values. So if you're doing a schedule risk analysis, you can take the output from an SRA and do a fit on it. That's just kind of a side note. These are not dates though, so I'm not going to select that. This is the primary difference. So if you're an at-risk user and have never done this before, this is the main difference. Now, usually, and what I showed in the first webinar a couple months ago was the top choice, continuous sample data, univariate data. That was my first webinar. All 5 of these tabs come into play with continuous sample data. However, watch what happens when I choose the last one, cumulative XP points, which is what we're dealing with. The Bootstrap, the chi-square binning, and the results tab all grayed out, because we're not doing any statistical testing in this. They're not going through a hypothesis test, finding p-values or any of that. This is simply a root mean squared calculation. It's algebra, not statistics. And so I'm not able to do a full hypothesis test, so all of that went away. The next tab is distributions, and it is kind of pre-selected ones that are promising. I'm not going to change any of the settings here, and that also gets back. I talked about that a lot in the first webinar, but I tend to go with what they've presented. Unless you have a specific one you want to check out, let it go with what it's guessed, say okay, and that fast, it's done a fit for us, and it is presenting us with the results. And you can see that that's, in essence, that's the same S-curve there between 400, 1400, 400, 1400, and there's a little bit of spillover past that, because remember that over here we told it there's 1 chance in 100 of exceeding 400 or 1400. So if I come into the value 400 in my graph, you see that the blue values are saying, which is the input itself, 1 chance of being below 400. Well, good, that's what I told it. And at the upper end, I told it 1400. 1 chance in 100 of being past that as the input. In red is something called the Kumaraswamy distribution. Till I got this version of at-risk, I'd never even heard of that distribution. It turns out it is very similar to the Beta General. It requires 4 parameters, a min, a max, and 2 shape parameters, just like the Beta General. But the mathematical aspects associated with the statistical characteristics turns out to be easier to work with. So it is a better fit, not by much. I mean, and this is just root mean squared error that this is based on. So the distributions that we're looking at that were fit to this are ranked in order of root mean squared error, Kumaraswamy being the best. You can see that it's almost a perfect overlay. If you wanted to go to Beta General instead, we'll take the Kumaraswamy off. You can see that one of the drawbacks to the Beta General is, for whatever reason, its minimum is, well, it says 0%, but if I could open that up a couple more decimals, it's something less than a full percent, because you can see over here in the statistical summary that the beta general goes down to a min of 14.75. So not quite as, in fact, it doesn't go at all. It doesn't even drop below the requested min. So that might be one reason to disregard the beta general, is its minimum is greater than what the expert had given me as a 1% fractile. Let's take that off, go back to Coomaraswamy. Well, the Coomaraswamy drops in just a hair below the 400. It also goes a shade above the maximum 1400. So at least it's acknowledged we could be below 400, above 1400. And you see other statistical characteristics along the side. If you're okay just blindly choosing the one that fits best, then it's a no-brainer. It's Coomaraswamy. If you want to see what it looks like as a PDF, we can change the graph we're looking at down here, go to probability density instead. You see the histogram basically is the question answer construction, and then you see what this particular Coomaraswamy would look like. You don't like that one? Turns out PERT's not far down the list. There's what it would look like, and maybe triangular is something. If you want to fall back to those, there's what your triangle would look like. You're still in control as the analyst. This is just a recommendation about what you choose. Let's say I've decided on Coomaraswamy though. So I now say write it to Excel. It's saying, okay, remind me again, did you base this on root mean squared error and you want it presented as the standard function? When I'm okay with that, say next, choose a cell to put it in, say enter, and now in that cell is everything at risk will need when the simulation is running to sample out ESLOC in thousands. To show you that if you're not an at-risk user, I can give you a sense of how that's going to happen. Right now, it's set to show me the static value, which usually is, unless I've changed it, the default is the expected value out of the distribution. When I put the dice on, I'm now looking at a random value. If I sit here and go function F9 on my computer, you see the effect of having planted that fit distribution in this cell. It is now a random variable that follows the specific Coomaraswamy distribution. And every time the simulation is run, it resamples out of that cell and does its full cost estimate with whatever was in this cell for ESLOC in thousands. Okay. Down below it, I said I was going to show you some other things here. If you're not an at-risk user, this is kind of a neat feature. There are some statistics available that I can use, some functions that I can include, that I did it in advance just to give us the ability, without having to go back and look at the graph each time, I can show you that sure enough, that 766.6 is the mean value. And if you want to know how close we came to what we gave, and those are the grade values along the side, at 01, 25.57, 975, and 99, I'm finding out from that Coomaraswamy what's going on at each of those same 5 fractals. So you can see how close we are, rounded to one number, how close we are to being at what the experts said. They told me 400, they said 500, they said 700. Look how close we came. And I really didn't design this to be that good of a fit. It's Coomaraswamy just worked out very well. Plus I've gotten the min, gotten the max. So all of these stats functions are referring to the theoretical distribution that is in the cell where we put the fit. Okay. Hopefully that gives you a sense now. If I had a rate that I'm using for how many lines of code could be done in a month, and a rate that I'm paying per month or per hour, I could build my estimate off of this. And every time the simulation runs through its iterations, it's sampling out of that distribution. That's what I'd planned on showing. How are we doing for questions now?
We still haven't gotten any, so I'm going to say that you'll notice we didn't have any power outages today.
No, we didn't.
Which is...
So it's not a sample size of one anymore, Megan. You've now got 2 instances where I warned them and nothing happened. So the safe thing, the prudent thing to do is to give a warning. Is it now it's happened twice in your life? Well, that's
yeah. And this when I say stuff like this, it drives my husband up a wall, and he says, "Oh yeah, well these are my anti-lion attack sneakers." He says, I've never been attacked by a lion while I'm wearing these sneakers, so it must work.
I think you married a clever man there. That's a cute comeback.
Absolutely. But even with that little extra time, we haven't gotten any more questions. So can you pop up your contact info?
Sure can.
We'll wrap it up here. We'll have these slides, the Excel spreadsheet, and the recording of today's webinar up on the ICEAonline.com/tech showcase site by lunchtime tomorrow. This has been a great little series. It's been great working with you these past three months, Steve. Thank you for your time and your expertise.
Likewise.
Yeah. Thanks everybody who tuned in. Thanks to everybody who is tuning in the future. Have a good rest of your day, rest of your week, and be good to each other. Take care.
Be careful out there. It is the 13th of the month.
All right. With that, have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.